This playlist collects together and organizes the component modules, which together will comprise our first lecture on the rise of empirical psychology. We shift from discussing the development of ontological frameworks within philosophy to a discussion of the rise of empirical psychology to accomplish two ends. On the one hand, it helps to highlight and illustrate a process whereby an ontological framework that is relatively poorly defined and loosely tied to the phenomenon begins to slowly but surely become more rigorously defined and tied to the phenomenon, such that theorists begin to formulate attributional and dynamical models, testing their predictive, retrodictive, manipulative, and experimental adequacy through an ever-increasing array of experimental methodologies, instrumentation, and design in a newly burgeoning experimental tradition. This helps to make concrete the ideas that we've been talking about implicitly when we talk about debates regarding the relative promise of an ontological framework within the philosophy of mind. And secondly, as we'll see, the developments in the philosophy of mind, the nature of the theories, the ways in which philosophers try to further develop and characterize philosophical accounts of the nature of the mind and its relationship to the physical world become more and more strongly shaped by considerations that are extra-disciplinary, outside of philosophy. And one of the important extra-disciplinary sources for ideology and data is empirical psychology, and ultimately the empirical disciplines within cognitive science. These, as we'll see, are not the only extra-disciplinary sources of inspiration that start to emerge in the beginning of the 20th century, but they are definitely very important. And so, in order to fully appreciate the theories that we look at, starting with our next set of lectures, we need to have an appreciation of some of the developments in empirical psychology. Let's turn our attention to the story arc for this particular lecture. We'll begin the lecture not with psychology at all, but actually with astronomy. We'll look at how a controversy in astronomy led to the categorization, the conceptualization of what we eventually come to know as reaction times. The categorization or conceptualization of this notion that in early astronomy gets referred to as the personal equation, gets resolved in part because someone operationalizes that phenomenon. They measure the personal equation through experimentation and develop instrumentation for its more precise measurement, and thereby allow them to account for it in astronomical observation. We'll see how those instruments and those operations make their way into physiology and then into mental chronometry, the measurement of the temporal duration and temporal sequencing of mental operations in the work of Cornelius Dunder. The operations, conceptualization, and experimental designs associated with mental chronometry then migrate again, this time into the nescient but evolving ideologies and research of Wilhelm Wundt, who takes the experimental designs from physiology and psychophysics learned from his mentors Mueller and Helmholtz, combining their precision and rigor together with a version of the mental chemistry that we first observed in the British empiricists, and begins to create the first experimental psychology, introspectionism in the form of voluntarism. Wundt becomes the first experimental psychologist, the first introspectionist. We'll consider two other introspectionists, one of his students, Titchener, and then Brentano. After concluding our discussion of Brentano, we will draw some morals about introspectionist psychology and their techniques, both their successes and their failures. We'll then cross the Atlantic and turn our attention to the first American school of psychology, functionalism. Early functionalism, much like early pragmatism, has no clear-cut leading figures or well-articulated doctrine, but it does come to represent a polar opposite approach to theorizing about the nature of the mind. Whereas the introspectionists attempt to take mentality and decompose it into a set of atomic molecular components and articulate a set of processes for combining and detaching these components with one another to shape our conscious experiences. The functionalists deny this and instead assert that consciousness is a homogeneous, unanalyzable phenomenon. The functionalists don't provide us with a great deal of explanatory, predictive, or manipulative success. However, they do serve as excellent critics that help sharpen conceptualizations, to point to weaknesses in methodology, and to help facilitate the transition from introspectionism to the next schools that we'll study. We'll round off this particular lecture by looking at Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychologists focus primarily on perception, looking to see if they can characterize rules through which the brain organizes perceptual input into meaningful wholes. Gestalt psychologists play an important role in the transition between physiology and a more cognitive-oriented psychology through their emphasis on meaning, insight, and problem solving. They also categorize a large variety of perceptual effects.